Arsen Ostrowski, thanks for joining us. You're with the International Legal Forum. Something coming up next week with the United Nations Human Rights Council. What's coming up and why are you so concerned about it?
Thanks, Chris. Look, we normally say there's only two things certain in life, death and taxes. We can add a third, that Israel will always be found guilty before the United Nations, and none more so than at the UN Human Rights Council. What is coming up is meant to be a commission of inquiry against Israel, but essentially will be an inquisition against Israel. This will be really unprecedented assault upon the Jewish state. Essentially what is happening is last year the UN Human Rights Council formed a commission of inquiry purportedly in the wake of Israel's war with Hamas last May. This war in which Hamas launched some almost 4,500 rockets at Israel. But the resolution creating this commission does not even mention Hamas, not even once. And the person that has been chosen to chair this commission, a woman by the name of Navi Pillay, who has a long-standing history of bias and hostility against Israel. And she already, even a few weeks after the very end of the war with Hamas, she already declared Israel guilty of violations of international law. Now she will be the person adjudicating this commission. And this commission is something that's unprecedented, even in the UN's own standards. This is the same Human Rights Council that has China, that has Cuba, that has Venezuela on it, and that will be judging Israel. It has a really systematic bias and obsession with the Jewish state. It is unprecedented in terms of scope, in terms of geographic location, and most significantly in terms of timing. It's meant to look at the root causes of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict stemming from the war last May, but it is something that can go back to before 1948 when Israel was established and in perpetuity into the future as well. So its scope is open-ended. It is something that is unprecedented, and it's something that we will know that what her conclusions will be. There will be an attack on Israel as a Jewish state. It will allege all sorts of allegations, including war crimes and crimes against humanity against us, but it is something that is obviously distortion of international law and manipulation of the truth and lacking in complete impartiality.
So there's no other commissions in the UN like this?
There is no commission like this at all. And something else we need to bear in mind, and this is sort of the absurdity and the real, the assault on Israel. There are a number of commissions at the moment. There are commissions on Syria, on Libya, on Yemen, for example. But the Commission on Israel is not only in perpetuity, it has a budget of some $4+ million, which is more than double any other commission. More than double on Syria, on Libya, on Yemen. It has 18 people that will be employed on this commission, again in perpetuity. So there's nothing that exists like this in terms of scope, in terms of open-endedness, and by the way, in terms of knowing what the outcome already is. You appoint someone like Navi Pillay, and by the way, her co-commissioners, the two individuals, have just as checkered and just as biased history against Israel, having already accused us of ethnic cleansing, of war crimes, calling for embargoes. So the outcome here, it's predetermined. Israel will not get a fair hearing. It never gets a fair hearing at the UN Human Rights Council, unfortunately, and that is the case.
So the International Legal Forum is working with a number of other organizations. What can you do and what are you planning to do?
Sure. We worked with 25+ organizations to recently put out a major report exposing this inherent bias of the Commission, of the very mandate that is meant to adjudicate Israel, and specifically exposing Navi Pillay and her co-commissioners for their lack of impartiality. Navi Pillay has already accused Israel of apartheid, of war crimes, of crimes against humanity, and this is the woman that is meant to be adjudicating our supposed guilt or innocence in any Western court of law. If you're a judge, you would never have been appointed in the first place, or you would have to recuse yourself over this kind of impartiality. But at the UN, you get rewarded for anti-Semitism and hostility against Israel. So we, together with our coalition of organizations, have certainly put out a report and information exposing her bias. We're working with friends and allies in Congress, as well as our partners in Europe and elsewhere around the world to try and encourage our allies and friends who care about truth, who care about democracy, and who care about the very essence of equality amongst the nations to speak out against this, because not only is it a direct assault on the truth, it's also a direct assault on the UN's own values. The UN Charter talks about equality amongst nations. Israel is one country denied equality, none more so before the UN. And by the way, the UN's own guidelines on fact-finding missions, commissions of inquiry, require there to be impartiality and objectivity amongst those persons chairing these commissions. So Navi Pillay and her co-commissioners are also in direct breach of the UN's very own guidelines on this.
What impact could this have on the Jewish state?
It could have potentially, very, very serious ramifications. Ultimately, Navi Pillay will be presenting her initial findings next week in Geneva at the UN Human Rights Council. We expect that in September, October, this will go to the UN General Assembly, where there will be a subsequent vote, presumably to impose sanctions on Israel, stemming from her findings, and it may also go towards the International Criminal Court, which is ultimately, I believe, what Navi Pillay and those other groups who are certainly supporting and promoting this ultimately want to take this. They want to essentially employ what is a form of lawfare, using international law as a political means to delegitimize and attack the State of Israel. What I would say is important in this case, if you remember in 1975, when the UN passed the infamous Zionism is Racism resolution, ultimately that was repealed. Navi Pillay's findings deserve to be in the dustbin of UN's history of anti-Semitism. But Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who was the US ambassador to the UN at that time, he stood at the podium of the UN General Assembly and he said that the United States does not acknowledge, it will not abide by, it will never acquiesce to this infamous act. And I believe the United States should once again lead the Western world, the family of democratic nations, in not only standing with Israel, but standing for the truth, standing for democracy.
And final question, what kind of response, you mentioned the U.S. Congress, what kind of response are you getting from the U.S. Congress?
Very positive. We've already seen members of Congress in a bipartisan fashion, both in the Senate as well as House Representatives, coming out and speaking out against this commission, speaking out against its bias, speaking out in support of Israel. So there's certainly been a great deal of support. The United States, of course, withdrew from the Human Rights Council a few years ago under the previous administration. It is back there now. There are questions about that, certainly, but the US does have a voice, and so it's imperative that they exercise that voice to stand up for their foremost ally, Israel, in a battle really for the truth.
Okay, Arsen Ostrowski from the International Legal Forum, thank you.
Thank you, Chris.